দিল্লি ভট্টাচার্য। পরিচয় পাত্র। ধন্যবাদ। আমি পরিচয়ের কে সঞ্চালনের দায়িত্ব নিই।
শোনা যাচ্ছে? আচ্ছা, প্রথমেই উত্তরপাড়া সিনে ক্লাব এবং তার সমস্ত সদস্য যারা আজকে এখানে উপস্থিত হয়েছেন এবং যারা আয়োজক, তাদের মধ্যে অনেকে অনেক পুরনো বন্ধু, অনেক কাল পরে তাদের সঙ্গে দেখা হয়ে গেল, সবাইকে ধন্যবাদ জানাচ্ছি। সোমেশ রয়েছেন, চন্দনদা রয়েছেন, থ্যাংক ইউ। হচ্ছে হ্যাঁ, ধন্যবাদ। তো আমি প্রথমেই অনুষ্ঠান আয়োজন করার জন্য ওদের ধন্যবাদ জানাচ্ছি। অনেক দিন ধরে শোনা যাচ্ছে না? ও হ্যাঁ, গত বেশ কিছুদিন ধরে সোমেশের সঙ্গে আমার কথাবার্তা হচ্ছিল। উনি এবং ওর দলের সবাই যে প্রচণ্ড পরিশ্রম করেছেন এত কম সময়ে, শুধু এই অনুষ্ঠানটা করার জন্য নয়, একই সঙ্গে বুলেটিনটা প্রকাশ করার জন্য। বুলেটিনে অনেকে লিখেছেন, বুলেটিনের প্রসঙ্গে পরে আসব, এবং এটা হওয়া খুবই দরকার ছিল। কুমার সাহানির প্রয়াণের পরেই অমৃত গঙ্গারের সঙ্গে আমার একদিন কথা হচ্ছিল এবং অমৃত গঙ্গার অভিযোগ করছিলেন যে বহু ফিল্ম সোসাইটি তাদের যা দায়িত্ব তা পালন করছে না। হ্যাঁ, এখন শোনা যাচ্ছে তো? হ্যাঁ, অমৃত গঙ্গার বলছিলেন যে অনেক ফিল্ম সোসাইটি ও অন্যান্য সাংস্কৃতিক সংগঠন তারা তাদের যা দায়িত্ব তা পালন করছে না। কুমার সাহানির, আমি কি আরেকটু এগিয়ে এখানটা আসবো? হ্যাঁ, দাঁড়িয়ে কোনো অসুবিধে নেই। এখন শোনা যাচ্ছে? শোনা যাচ্ছে? ধন্যবাদ। হ্যাঁ হ্যাঁ, তো প্রথমেই যেটা বলছিলাম যে এই অনুষ্ঠানটা করার পেছনে প্রচণ্ড পরিশ্রম আছে সোমেশ এবং ওদের দলের সবার। এবং আরও একটা সাংঘাতিক ব্যাপার ছিল এই বুলেটিনটা সময়ে প্রকাশ করা, লেখাগুলো অনুবাদ করা। গত বেশ কিছুদিন ধরে এটা নিয়ে আমাদের কথাবার্তা চলছিল এবং এই বুলেটিনটা যে করা গেছে তার জন্য অনেকের কাছে আমরা ঋণী, আমরা কৃতজ্ঞ। যেমন ললিন জয়ামানে, অস্ট্রেলিয়ান ফিল্ম স্কলার, যিনি কুমার সাহানির ওপরে এখনও পর্যন্ত একমাত্র বইটি লিখেছেন, দি এপিক সিনেমা অফ কুমার সাহানি। ললিন খুবই ব্যক্তিগত সংকটের মধ্যে, অসুস্থতার মধ্যে রয়েছেন, তবুও একটা লেখা খুব কম সময়ে আমাদের দিয়েছেন। আরও অনেকগুলো গুরুত্বপূর্ণ লেখা এবারের বুলেটিনে আছে এবং সেগুলো অত্যন্ত কম সময়ে অনুবাদ করে উত্তরপাড়া সিনে ক্লাব প্রকাশ করেছেন এবং এই অনুষ্ঠান আয়োজন করেছেন। এই জন্য তাদের ধন্যবাদ দিই। কুমার প্রয়াত হওয়ার ঠিক পরে পরে অমৃত গঙ্গারের সঙ্গে আমার একবার এটা নিয়ে কথা হচ্ছিল। অমৃত গঙ্গার অভিযোগ করছিলেন যে বিভিন্ন ফিল্ম সোসাইটি, সিনে ক্লাব, অন্যান্য সাংস্কৃতিক সংগঠন তাদের যে দায়িত্ব পালন করা উচিত এক্ষেত্রে, অর্থাৎ কুমার সাহানির ছবি আরও বেশি করে দেখানো উচিত, তা নিয়ে আলোচনা হওয়া উচিত, সেটা করছে না। এমনিতেই ওর ছবি পাওয়া খুব মুশকিল। যেমন আপনারা জানেন 4 অধ্যায় আজকে দেখানো সম্ভব হচ্ছে, 4 অধ্যায়ের ডিভিডি আছে বলে। অন্য বেশিরভাগ ছবি এইভাবে লভ্য নয় এবং এখন ছবিগুলো ন্যাশনাল ফিল্ম আর্কাইভ, সেটা এনএফডিসির অধীনে, এনএফডিসি ছবি দেখানো নিয়ে প্রচুর সমস্যা তৈরি করে। আমি একটা উদাহরণ দিই। আমি রাস্তায় আস্তে আস্তে বলছিলাম, কিছুদিন আগেই আমার এক বন্ধু ফিল্ম কিউরেটর বার্লিনে মায়াদর্পণ দেখানোর চেষ্টা করছিলেন। আমি তার সঙ্গে এনএফডিসির যোগাযোগ করিয়ে দিলাম, কিন্তু মায়াদর্পণ দেখানো গেল না, কারণ এনএফডিসি একটিমাত্র স্ক্রিনিং করার জন্য $1200 দাবি করলো। তো এই রকম পরিস্থিতিতে আরও বেশি করে সাংস্কৃতিক সংগঠনগুলোর এবং সিনে ক্লাবগুলোর এগিয়ে আসা উচিত। সেই দায়িত্ব উত্তরপাড়া করছেন। ইতিমধ্যেই ওদের বুলেটিন আন্তর্জাতিকভাবে সমাদৃত। আমি সোশ্যাল মিডিয়ায় প্রায়ই দেখি বাংলাদেশের পাঠকরা, বাংলাদেশের সিনেফিলরা ওদের বুলেটিনের কথা বলেন। তো এইটুকু ভূমিকা করে আমি বেশি সময় নেব না। আমি ডেকে নেব আমাদের আজকের মূল বক্তা অধ্যাপক আশিস অভিকুণ্ঠককে, যাকে নতুন করে পরিচয় করাবার সিনেফিলদের মধ্যে কিছু নেই, কিন্তু এটা একটা প্রথা যে আমি যেহেতু সঞ্চালক, ফলে এই অপ্রিয় কাজটা আমাকে করতে হবে, ওর পরিচিতি আবার আমাকে বলতে হবে। আশিস অভিকুণ্ঠক চলচ্চিত্র, মিডিয়া এবং সাংস্কৃতিক নৃতত্ত্বের অধ্যাপক, ইউনিভার্সিটি অফ রোড আইল্যান্ডে। এবং তার চেয়েও যেটা বেশি গুরুত্বপূর্ণ, আশিস অভিকুণ্ঠক আমাদের সময়ের একজন অন্যতম গুরুত্বপূর্ণ, আমরা যদি বলি এক্সপেরিমেন্টাল সিনেমা, তো এক্সপেরিমেন্টাল সিনেমা, অমৃত গঙ্গার হলে বলতেন সিনেমা প্রয়োগা, যাই বলুন, পরীক্ষামূলক ছবির অন্যতম গুরুত্বপূর্ণ একজন পরিচালক। তার অনেক ছবি আমরা অনেকে দেখেছি, আপনারা অনেকেই নিশ্চয়ই দেখেছেন, রতি চক্রবহ থেকে শুরু করে কল্কি মন্থনের কথা, আরও বহু ছবি আশিস বানিয়েছেন, তা নিয়ে বহু আলোচনা হয়েছে, লেখালেখি হয়েছে। এবং আশিস এর আগে একাধিক বক্তব্য রেখেছেন, লিখেছেন, আমি যদি ভুল না করে থাকি, কুমার সাহানি, মনিকাউল এদের ছবি নিয়ে। এইটুকু ভূমিকা করে আমি আশিসকে ডেকে নেব তার আজকের বক্তব্য রাখার জন্য। এটাকে যতটা সম্ভব ইনফর্মাল রাখাই ভালো। আমার সঙ্গে সোমেশ ও অন্যদের কথা হয়েছে, আশিস অভিকুণ্ঠক ওর বক্তব্য রাখবেন, আমরা 4 অধ্যায় দেখব এবং তারপরে একটা প্রশ্নোত্তর পর্ব হবে যেখানে আমি সঞ্চালনা করব এবং আশিস আমাদের সবার প্রশ্নের উত্তর দেবেন। আমরা একটা আলোচনা, শুধু প্রশ্নোত্তর নয়, সবাই মিলে একটা আলোচনা তৈরি করব। এইটুকু বলে আমি আশিসকে ছেড়ে দিচ্ছি জায়গাটা। অনেক দেরি করে দিলাম, দুঃখিত। ও আমি এখানে দিই। হ্যাঁ হ্যাঁ ঠিক আছে, লাগছে। হ্যাঁ
না ঠিক আছে, শুনতে পাচ্ছেন? আচ্ছা, আমার একটাই প্রবলেম আছে, আমি অবাঙালি, তো আর আমার এত ঔপচারিক বাংলা বলার অভ্যেস নয়, তার জন্যে আপনা থেকে ক্ষমা চেয়ে আমি ইংরেজিতে বলবো। ডাজ দ্যাট ওয়ার্ক? যদি আমি বাংলায় সিনেমা বানাই, দ্যাটস ডিফারেন্ট স্টোরি, বাট আমার এই ফর্মাল বাংলা বললে প্রচণ্ড আমার ও তো I mean, I do not have that kind of a complex vocabulary in Bangla to speak, especially when I'm going to speak on Kumar. So first of all, I want to thank Uttapara Cine Club and everybody for asking me to speak on Kumar. I'm deeply touched by this invitation because I never worked with Kumar. I'm not really a close part of his close collaborative circle, so I was first surprised when I was asked, but I'm really deeply appreciative that I have been asked to speak about Kumar. I come from a world of filmmaking, as some of you might know, which is completely outside the framework of what we call market cinema, and Kumar, along with Manikol, are two of the foremost earliest filmmakers in India who started thinking about this very, very carefully. And I just want to speak about that today, is that why is Kumar Shahani so important to us? Why it is important in today's time, especially to watch his films, and why the kind of films he made still have not just an aesthetic value, but it also has a profound political value in the times that we live in. Now, there's a very important relationship that Kumar had with Bengal, and that relationship is mediated by Ghotok, which is something that some of you or most of you would know of. Now, what Kumar would often speak about and has written about, that the reason Ghotok becomes so fundamentally important to him is because Ghotok is one of the first filmmakers in India who is thinking theoretically, and this is something very important to understand. And this is what I have written about in the essay that has been published in the pamphlet. What is thinking theoretically about cinema, thinking theoretically through cinema. Now, what Ghotok is doing is something very important, is that unlike his contemporary like Ray or Sen and others, he is not merely interested in telling a narrative which depicts the state of contemporary India or Bengal or however you want to look at it, but he is also very, very interested, unlike both these filmmakers, to think theoretically about the state of post-colonial India. What does it mean to be an Indian theoretically, not affectively, as in not emotionally, which is something that you see in the films of Ray very, very distinctively. There's an emotional resonance of what it means to be a post-colonial subject. What Ghotok very specifically, and this is what for me, Ghotok is fundamentally important, and I think Kumar, at least in his writings, talk about Ghotok in that way, is that Ghotok is one of the first filmmakers in post-colonial India who is trying to think theoretically in terms of how class and caste matters in the making of a post-colonial India, which is something other contemporary filmmakers do not do. And one of the reasons that Ghotok is doing that is that he is deeply influenced and deeply interested in Marxist historical understanding of the state, of the contemporary state in India at that time. Now, Ghotok, and how do we see that? For example, we see in many of his films that he is not merely trying to create a narrative arc. There are moments where he destabilizes those arcs. For example, one of his most important films for me, his earliest film, is Ajantrik. In Ajantrik, you will see these moments where we are moving into a narrative where there are these locations where you move outside the basic arc and move into an Adivasi consciousness. Now, this is something what I would consider thinking theoretically about what it means to be an Indian in the 1950s, is that the Indian trajectory is not just a mere trajectory of celebration of breaking away from the colonial, British colonial enterprise, but also trying to think that within the post-colonial framework, there are moments of deep disquiet that the Indian state, especially in the 1950s, was not able to come to terms with. And I think those moments in Ajantrik when he's moving into these Adivasi spaces, and there are like, if there are at least 15 to 20 minutes in the whole film where we have a very deep intrusion into what we would call a Jharkhandi Adivasi space, which other filmmakers of his time is not thinking about, for instance. And that we see constantly coming in his film when he's invoking Baul music, for instance, or when he's invoking Shamo Shangit, for instance, when he's invoking, for example, in Shubhanareka, astonishingly importantly, when you have, when the realization happens is that the main protagonist is actually a son of a lower caste woman. That totally transforms the narrative of the film. These are moments where I would argue is unlike his contemporaries, he's trying to create a theoretical framework of what it means to be a post-colonial subject, which I think reaches an exemplary formation when he is doing Jukti Tokko Goppo. Probably for me, one of the most theoretical cinematic narrative in Indian cinema history. Now, it is following him that Kumar and Manikal, both the filmmakers, along with John Abraham, so they're basically three filmmakers, John Abraham, Manikal and Kumar Shahani, who take up this thinking theoretically about the Indian situation through cinema. Now, for instance, we do have a lot of scholars in academia, in writing essays who are thinking theoretically about the state of what it means to be a post-colonial country. But cinema, the important thing is that cinema in the 1950s and 60s was imagined, especially by the state, as a means of mass communication. So here was a very clear dichotomy that is emerging in the 1960s and 70s, is that at one end you have cinema as a means of entertainment, pure simple entertainment, and on the other hand the state is thinking of cinema as a means of propaganda or a means of mass communication. So you have very two clear distinct form of cinema that is emerging. One is entertainment cinema and one is what we call films division, documentary kind of cinema, which is basically pure propaganda. Now, when NFDC, in its earlier formation, FFC, Film Finance Corporation, comes in 1969, their basic attempt is to create narrative cinema as a means of mass communication. So what you see in the history of what we call parallel cinema, majority, I think, I'm not sure of the exact number of films funded by NFDC from 1969 to early 2000, but approximately what 300 to 400 films, or probably 500 films were made, out of which majority of the films are following the mass communication model, in the sense that we have, these are films funded by the state to realistically portray a world of Indian post-colonial situation. Where Mani and Kumar shifts, and that's why their radicality is important, is that they are not interested in just mere depiction. They are interested in thinking theoretically through cinema, which they have learned from Ghotok. In the case of Kumar, and Kumar talks about 3 gurus of his life, and he would do that till his last days. I had a chance of spending time with him in the last year of his life when he had moved to Calcutta, and he would very, very often, almost every time I would meet him, would invoke Robert Bresson, the important French filmmaker, Hrithik Ghotok, and D.D. Kosambi. I don't know how many of you are familiar with D.D. Kosambi. D.D. Kosambi is one of the foremost Marxist historian in India. We often nowadays hear of Marxist historian in terms of people like Romila Thapar, Irfan Habib, and other historians who teach at JNU and D School and other places. But one of the first people to think about medieval ancient India through a Marxist framework or through a Marxist lens was D.D. Kosambi, who passed away in 1966. In the last year of D.D. Kosambi's life, Kumar had a very deep interaction with him. Kumar at that time was a student at FTI in Pune, and Kosambi used to live in Pune. Kosambi was fundamentally a mathematician who taught at Tata Institute of Fundamental Research in Bombay, but he would live in Pune. And along with his mathematical work, he was also a historian. Now, he is a historian who, in order to understand the importance of Kosambi, we have to understand what was the nature of history being written about ancient and medieval India before he came. He is basically writing a series of essays between early 50s till his death in the 60s, and he produces a very radical imagination of medieval and ancient India. Now, the history of historiography, that is the history of writing history about ancient and medieval Indian history, starts around the late 18th century. Especially, most of you would have heard of William Jones from the Asiatic Society. Now, William Jones is one of the first people who was one of the first people to make a connection between the idea that India has a very deep past that needs to be studied. And this connection he makes in his very important essay he publishes, I think, in 1779, if I'm like probably around 1779 or 1789, where he makes 89. So he makes a very important correlationship between Sanskrit, Persian and the Romantic languages, suggesting that these three groups of languages have a proto or a mother language, or called the Proto-Indo-European languages. Now with that, around the late 18th century, you have German Indologists, French Indologists and British Indologists getting into the world of Indian history and trying to recreate what Indian past would have been. Now throughout the 19th century and the early 20th century, the history that was being constructed was basically what we call a chronological history. So if you read, and this is something that we even see now, is that when you read about, let's say, the Delhi Sultanate, you would hear about this was one dynasty, second dynasty, third dynasty. In dynasty 1, this was the first ruler, the second ruler, the third ruler. So the general historical understanding, especially of ancient India and medieval India, was chronological and dynastic historiography. And almost all histories written till 1940s and 1950s did not take into account something that we take, which we are very used to now, idea about class, idea about caste, idea about social inequality, idea about economic inequality. These were not the elements, or these were not the framework through which Indian historiography would be written. Indian historiography till that time, till the 1940s and 50s, were basically dynastic historiography. So when Kasambi is important, because Kasambi is the first historian who is arguing that we cannot understand Indian past without talking about class, without talking about caste, without talking about social inequalities and economic inequalities, for which he wrote a series of essays. The other thing he does, something which is also very, very unusual, is that in the world of prehistoric, let's say, so in India we have written records in terms of around the time when the Vedic texts are being written, which is approximately dated between 1900 BCE till about 1200 BC, which is when the Vedic corpus are being written. But prior to that, we have what we call the prehistoric or the proto-historic, which is in the context of Harappan civilization, which is a prehistoric society. It's basically a proto-historic because we don't have any written records. And then if you go even further down, further late, you have the Paleolithic or the Microlithic eras, in which we don't have any records other than stone tools. So what Kasambi also does very brilliantly is that he starts talking about stone tools that is found in our in local usages. For example, Sheel Loda. For example, if you know Sheel Loda, so he's one of the first people to say that the Sheel Loda which is used in our houses has a prehistoric origin going back to at least 6000 BCE. So these kind of connection is something that Kasambi is one of the first figures in history to start doing. The other thing he does very brilliantly is that he roams around Buddhist sites in Maharashtra and Madhya Pradesh, and he starts looking for ancient roads. And he is also one of the first scholars to argue that some of the most important Buddhist sites in Western and Central India are actually on ancient trading routes. So what is very interesting about Kasambi is that in the 1950s, here is a mathematician who is actually thinking very closely about history, about class, about inequality within ancient Indian and medieval India, medieval historiography. And Kumar is working with him. In the sense he's learning from him, while Kumar is a student at FTI. So what you see is in Kumar Shahani's film is this extraordinary intellectual framework which is emerging at one end from Ritwik Ghatak, his Marxist historical understanding about Bengal. On the other end is Robert Bresson and the way he is working with actors, the way staging happens. So you will see, one of the few things you will see very clearly in Kumar Shahani's film is the way the actors are acting, or what we call how staging occurs in cinema, is distinctly dissimilar to melodrama, which is the Hindi, Bollywood kind of film, and also very importantly, distinctly dissimilar to realistic narrative, which is something you see in Ray and Adur Gopalakrishnan, Gautam Ghosh, and that whole school of filmmakers, which are very realistic. So here what is happening very interesting is Kumar is deeply inspired by Robert Bresson's and his staging and acting, which is suggestive. That is that everything does not necessarily have to be depicted. A lot of staging has to be left, the interpretation has to be left on the audience to decipher how the actor is acting, which is something you will see in the film that we'll watch today. So you might find the film too slow, you might find the actors acting very differently, as in their emotions are not so realistically portrayed, is because Kumar is thinking about staging in a very, very different way, which is a term that which is not just Kumar Shahani, but also Manikal is also using that kind of staging. If some of you have seen my film, you would see a similar kind of de-affective staging that you see, that actors are almost like a model, not actors which are imbibed with affective framework. A term that I have been using, I have written something about it, the term that I call this is called infra-realism. Now, infra-realism, to just put it very simply, if we have realism at 0 degree, that is the way you see me right now, the way I see you, it's realistic, right? It's naturalistic. So if I want to recreate that, as what we are trying to do on this phone, which is basically just documenting it, but suppose we want to recreate this scene, you would do it in a realistic way, where you will have an actor like me, actor copying me, speaking like me, and there will be an audience. So this is, let's say, if this realistic form is 0 degree, then you have melodrama, which goes higher, right? So which becomes more dramatic, more opulent in the way emotions are depicted. Infra-realism would be the other extreme, where it goes down, where realistic elements are carefully depleted and it totally goes down. So this kind of acting or this kind of staging, Bresson is one of the few filmmakers who does that for the first time, but unfortunately in the case of Bresson, it really does not, you do not see such staging in any part of the world. It's very interestingly that kind of staging percolates into India in the work of Kumar and Mani, and probably a bit of my own work. Now, so you have Bresson on one end, Ghotak on another end, and at the center, I would argue, is Kosambi. Kosambi's thinking of a historical materialistic thinking of world that you see very powerfully emerging in Kumar Shahani's film. So the first film he makes, the first film is Maya Darpan. Unfortunately, we were trying to see if we can get Maya Darpan, but as Poricha has said, that the present dispensation at NFDC is charging an astonishingly exorbitant amount, which is probably unaffordable. That's the only film which has been restored of the six feature length work and a whole bunch of other films that Kumar made in his lifetime. Now, Maya Darpan is a film that if you feel like, you could probably watch a very bad print on YouTube. Rimley is saying don't watch, I would also say don't watch. But if you have to watch it, it's a good idea just to get a sense. Maya Darpan is a film which is a massive Marxist critique of patriarchy and feudalism in post-colonial India. It's a story written by a very important Hindi writer, Nirmal Verma. Some of you might have heard of him. And Nirmal Verma talks about, it's a story of a woman and the story is about a woman and her struggle with her feudalistic father and how she gets caught in this post-colonial patriarchal society, which Kumar then kind of takes it from there, and it becomes a stringent critique of feudalism, highly inspired by a Kosambian way of thinking. His next film is a film called Tarang. Now what was very interesting, and this is very important to mention, is that when Maya Darpan came out in 1972, it was unanimously attacked, not just by the commercial Hindi cinema world, but it was also attacked by the world of realistic filmmaker, including Manikda. Satyajit Ray in 1974 writes an essay where he is comparing two films of one by Kumar Shahani and Maya Darpan. The other film is Uski Roti by Manikal, and he compares it with films made by Shyam Benegal and argues that the films that Mani and Kumar made were waste of the government fund, and they were not meant to even be made. Now that particular, this is a short, succinctly put what Ray is trying to say. The attack on Kumar and Mani by Ray was so profound that Kumar Shahani could not make a film for the next 12 years. Keep in mind, filmmaking at that time was super expensive like it is today. But at that time, there was the only way of making different kind of cinema outside the market was to get funding from NFDC. Now, if a figure like Satyajit Ray criticizes your film, it's almost the end of your career. And that was the case with Kumar and Mani. They both had to struggle intensely for the next 10-15 years to even make films. They figured out their different ways, but Kumar's next film was made in 1984, which was 12 years after Maya Darpan, a film called Tarang. Now Tarang, if Maya Darpan was a Marxist critique of feudalism, Tarang takes the Marxist criticism to another different level, where in Tarang you have an extraordinary, incisive, theoretical way of understanding what post-colonial bourgeois capitalism is doing to India in the 1970s. A film which is located around emergency and post-emergency, where the narrative is located in a family of a bourgeois capitalist in Bombay and his working class, and contrasted with the working class milieu in which that particular business is located. It's a film unlike Maya Darpan, written by Kumar on its own, and I think of this as a much more powerful, hard-hitting, theoretically trying to understand what bourgeois capitalism is doing to Indian consciousness. Subsequently, he makes a film a few years later, which for me is my favorite film, is a film called Khyal Ghata, where you have, this is a moment where Khyal Ghata is made in 1988, and it's a film which he is breaking away from the Marxist Kosambian way of making film and getting into the world of what I would call later Kumar, the later phase of Kumar, which is highly influenced by Indian theories of music, Indian theories of dance, and Indian theories of aesthetics. So here is something very interesting happening. You have a filmmaker who is deeply influenced by a filmmaker like Ghotok, who is trying to think about pre-modernity within the modern context, where he's talking about Baul, or he's talking about Adivasis, or he's talking about lower caste in his narrative, to a filmmaker who is talking about patriarchy and criticizing bourgeois capitalism, to a shift, a very dramatic shift, where I think Kumar is recognizing that Marxist historical criticism and understanding is not enough, that we have to go beyond. And this is something that happens both with Mani and Kumar, the only two filmmakers who are moving away from, who are, I won't say in case of Kumar who is moving away, but in case of Mani he was already deeply